Right, yes. So I'm Judith Green. I'm not Michael McHugh. Michael McHugh only told me a few days ago that he wasn't able to come, for which I shall never forgive him. And in a particularly cruel irony, the digital story that you saw in the last workshop about Westgate Hill in Newcastle, that is actually Michael McHugh, so it makes me feel even worse about it. Anyway, there's a couple of things also sort of occurred to me during the course of this very long and diverse and interesting day. One is that the title of this talk is incredibly boring, actually. It says a case study of co-design and co-production. I mean, basically, I haven't had any links with the Heritage Network before. I am sort of loosely involved in one of the Connected Communities project, and I was sent the email asking for presentations, so I thought sort of why not, and it said that one of the things they were interested in was case studies of co-production, co-research and co-inquiry, so therefore there it is in the title. But actually personally they aren't terms that I would ever use without a big sneer, so I'm going to sort of back off that title really. The other thing I've realised is that although the organisation that I represent is actually a small, completely volunteer-run organisation, in fact, a lot of the things we do are very similar in sort of range to a lot of projects people have been talking about. Sort of drama, storytelling, art-based projects, oral history, all that sort of thing. But the big difference is that we're very cheap. And I think you might describe what one of the earlier speakers today would have described us as enthusiastic amateurs. Although I think there's kind of an interesting question about whether there's such a clear-cut distinction between amateurs and maybe academics. Maybe that's the other half. Anyway, I'm actually secretary of an organisation with the exciting title of the St James Heritage and Environment Group. The St James Heritage and Environment Group, which is wholly run by volunteers in the West End of Newcastle. Michael McHugh, who can't be here, is part of a small 3-person outreach team for the Tyne and Wear Archives and Museums, and he's based at the Discovery Museum in Newcastle. Our original plan was to do a sort of Socratic dialogue where he would sort of interrogate me about the experience of working with the museums and archives. But since he's not here, and I've had to prepare this, it's actually much more descriptive rather than analytical, so I hope you'll bear with me. Right, part of this West End story, sorry, let's look at that, not at that. Part of this West End Stories project is linked with the Connected Communities project called Imagine, which is bigger and more complicated than I could tell you in half an hour really. There's a lot of universities involved. We're part of the historical package, which is led by Durham University and Warwick University, and Imagine North East is actually the historical package, looking at the history of community engagement in Benmore in the West End of Newcastle, and North Shields, which is in North Tyneside nearby. That particular project is looking at civic participation, how people get involved and influence life in their communities in the North East. And among the other hats that I wear, I was actually pulled in to coordinate the 10 community projects for Imagine North East. So in Benmore we have a number of community partners, some of them completely volunteer-run organisations, others sort of small charities in the West End of Newcastle, and also the Tyne and Wear Archives and Museums are a partner. Right. Oops. Sorry, the lighting is not very good. Right. Okay. So I think we jumped a bit actually. Right. Well, I think one of the points that obviously we want to make is that the Imagine project, which sort of has a number of community partnerships, is actually predicated on the pre-existing network of relationships between community organisations in the area. I mean, the idea of bringing together community partners and looking at the history of the area in different ways is not something, obviously, that was invented by Durham University, but lots of different organisations have been doing that kind of thing for a long time, and Imagine was able to sort of piggyback onto it. This is something that Michael actually put together, going back a bit, about the history of his work with some of the community organisations in the West End, where, as you can see, he actually said that they came to realise that the museums and archives actually needed the community more than the community needed them. So what they decided to do was to actually go in for creating long-term, genuine, equal partnerships, rather than kind of parachuting in with special projects and trying to recruit people and organisations in the community to take part in them. And the project I'm going to talk about this afternoon actually comes out of that ongoing long-term partnership. Right, that's a very fancy diagram that Michael's put together about all his different relationships with organisations in the area. I mean, really the key ones, obviously, from my point of view, are the yellow ones at the top, in which is the Archives and Museums, ourselves, the Heritage and Environment Group, and between them something called the St James Heritage and Culture Partnership, which is an informal partnership that brings together a lot of community organisations and mediates a lot of the heritage work and culture work that goes on, but isn't kind of a gatekeeper or exclusive. There's also independent relationships and other projects as well. I'll just say something very quickly about the area, actually, because that's actually quite important. If people don't know the West End of Newcastle, it's actually one of the poorest areas in the country. It sort of scores very highly on everything. And if you know much about it, what you might know is that there were sort of riots there in 1991, in which quite a lot of places were burned down, and basically the sort of police and the authorities kind of lost control of the area for several nights, which is a legacy that the local community is desperate to kind of overcome, as it were, and actually replace with stories about the area that are kind of more positive and different. Another thing about that area is that it actually has, I mean, obviously every area has an interesting history, but West Newcastle sort of intersects with I suppose, kind of national historical things, sorry, that's not a very articulate thing to say. I mean, Hadrian's Wall, for example, goes through the middle of Benwell, and we actually have a Roman temple and a Vallum crossing, which you can go and look at, which sit in the middle of housing estates. There was important coal mining industry there, so many people argue that actually railways started in the West End of Newcastle as part of the sort of wagonways that were established for moving the coal. It was a site of a key battle in the Civil War. And then more recently, if you come to the 19th century, the West End of Newcastle housed some of the major heavy engineering industries that are sort of significant in the second phase of the Industrial Revolution. And we were particularly good on armaments. We armed both sides in several major conflicts. And obviously all that's gone now is almost completely deindustrialised and very, very poor. However, the area does have, as you can see from this diagram, a strong infrastructure of voluntary and community organisations, which have basically grown up over recent decades to address a lot of the problems, address a lot of the needs, built from the bottom upwards. And I think one minor point I'd like to drop in is that we often say that it's the voluntary and community sector in the area that's the mainstream. I mean, you get, local authorities, health authorities, universities and so on have big projects, they come in, they go out, things start, things stop. But in the meantime, these little organisations with maybe one or two workers or no workers at all, they carry on. And that's, that's actually something that's worth thinking about when you're looking at sort of doing heritage projects with the community. So, West End Stories. So West End Stories started with an exhibition in the Discovery Museum in 2013. We'd already done quite a few joint things by then, and we've been talking about developing quite an ambitious exhibition, because there was a lot of talk at that time about History Pin and other sort of new digital things that were developing, and we thought we'd be really great to do something like that about the history of the West End of Newcastle. But in the end, our ambitions kind of melted away, and we had a deadline because we had this, the outreach team had this space booked in the museum, and at that point the series on Radio 4, The World in 1,000 Objects, was running, which you'd sort of pick up on as you were driving around, and that just sort of occurred to us that that was actually a really good way of approaching it. So we decided to go with that approach of using objects in the broadest sense to tell stories about the area without any overarching narrative. Apart from the benefits of being able to give expression to lots of different voices by doing it that way, this had, for me personally, had an advantage that we were actually able to sidestep the question of what particular narrative we would settle on, particularly for the last couple of decades, because recent decades in the area have been very difficult. There's been huge regeneration schemes which have kind of split the community, and different community organisations have actually accepted or opted for different things, and there have been very difficult periods which has taken a long time to kind of keep the community together and keep working relationships going. So in one way it was kind of easier not to have an overarching narrative which is bound to upset one person or another. Okay, so I've just got some pictures to flip through fairly quickly about the West End Stories in the museums. So this was in the People's Gallery in the Discovery Museum. And it was a genuinely joint exhibition, in the sense that the archives and museums people did all the sort of heavy-duty kind of curating and sort of creating the displays and that sort of thing. But we jointly planned what was going into it, and we jointly sort of sourced the exhibits. There were two main elements to it. One was objects that were in the museum's collection. So when I should explain, the Tyne-and-Wear Archives and Museums covers 5 district council areas in the Tyne-and-Wear area, which was once a county council until it was abolished by the Thatcher government. And it includes several large museums, art galleries, and some heritage sites. So it's sort of quite a big enterprise. And among all these institutions, there are lots and lots of objects and documents and paintings and so on relating to the West End of the city, many of which have been kind of lurking in basements and storage areas, for maybe 90 years, and actually never seen the light of day. And one of the things that we thought was important, and Mike is particularly passionate about that, is that those objects actually relate to the history of the area. They relate to a community which is still there. And that those objects should be able to be seen by people because they're part of that history. So one of the things that we did was actually pull out a selection of really interesting objects that link to the history of the area. But the other thing that we did was show objects that kind of relate to the history of the community and tell stories from the community's point of view, like interviews, archive, film, and objects such as the ones you see here. I don't think you make out what they are. They're knitted tanks. The West End of Newcastle was home to Vickers Armstrong, originally Armstrong's engineering company, which was set up in 1847. And one of the things that they were very famous for was making tanks. In fact, only very recently they've stopped making tanks. So apart from the fact that thousands of people who lived in the West End worked there and actually made tanks, within living memory, they were kind of common sight around the area because they used to test them up and down the cobbled streets. It's a very steep hillside going down at the time. And, you know, people would tell me how they were playing out in the street with their skipping ropes as kids and being rumbling. These tanks would kind of come up there. So it's very much part of people's memories. So these knitted things here actually relate to, sounds like Blue Peter, a project that we did earlier. When I say we, is some other community organisations that I worked with, where we got people knitting scenes and buildings that actually meant a lot to them in the area's history. And that shows you some of the things, including the knitted tanks. And that's the sort of the whole, that's more of this exhibition was, this particular project was called the Woolly West. Everything is made out of wool. And actually next to it on the left in the exhibition we showed on a loop a part animated, part documentary film that we were involved in making, which you can get on YouTube. It's called Knitting Together, and it's actually about people's experience of living with major regeneration and change in an area. And it uses these woolly things, so the houses kind of unravel, you know, sort of showing the kind of huge like regeneration, clearance, change in the area. The sort of knitted people run around and the flowers grow. That is a genuine Roman object that was dug out of Benwell. We had various sets of kind of interviews and film material that people could look at. It's the flyer for it. As well as the actual exhibition, we had a whole programme of activities and events and so on, because we wanted to get people in and talking to us and talking to each other. And actually also talking about some of the difficulties. I said about us avoiding the sort of narrative, but actually some of the talks and the workshops were set up so that we could have some of those difficult discussions, but you know, in a kind of safer and less public kind of context. Over the time the exhibition was there, it was they have this thing called the late shows. It's probably national, but kind of once a year for 2 evenings at a weekend, the late shows where every sort of heritage place or gallery or museum or whatever is open until late at night and people can come in free. And the late shows of Discovery Museum, we invited the people who've been involved in knitting the Woolly West to come in, and they kind of they knitted and they talked to people about the project. And that is Michael McHugh. If you see him, you're very pleased if you abuse him for not turning and leaving me on my own. And he's one of the knitters is trying to show him how to knit. And that's two of the knitters at nearly 11 o'clock at night. I think they normally go to bed quite early after EastEnders or something, but they were determined to stick it out till midnight when it finished. Right, so even before the exhibition at the museum was actually really finished putting up, we had this idea. I mean, having kind of sourced this material from the basement of the archives and the museums and so on, we thought, this should really be seen by more people whose kind of history it is, sort of thing. And so we decided to kind of roll it out into the community under the title of West End Stories in the Community. And so far it's been to 5 different venues in the community, and that's not been as easy as it sounds, because Newcastle has had this programme of library closures and all sorts of things, and sometimes things have been in somewhere for only a few weeks and we've had to move them again. We've had little pop-up exhibitions that have moved around, from the museum, it's raised a lot of kind of interesting practical issues from the museum's point of view, because they've never done anything like this before, and it created all these sort of terrible panics about insurance and safety and all sorts of stuff, It's actually much easier to mount an exhibition in a museum than it is to take it out, but nevertheless, the result of this is that these things have actually been seen by thousands of people. what we wanted to do was to integrate these displays. I mean, they were obviously, each one wasn't nearly as big as a thing in the museum. We're talking about, you know, a few cabinets and so on. But we wanted the displays to kind of be sort of part of everyday life. So people who wouldn't kind of visit a museum, you know, as a sort of consumer experience, as it were, they would kind of see it on their way into the library and customer service centre when they went to pay their rent or something like that. So we very much want to integrate it into the everyday life of the area, and so that people could access these things. Again, there was a programme of activities and events of all different kinds to go with it. And so there were two main types of objects that were actually in these displays. One was, I say, things that we'd already collected, and other things that came from the sort of from the archives and museums. But we also sought for the West End Stories in the community to get people living in the area or former residents to give or loan us objects that they had at home, or you know, they knew how to get access to, that in some ways told a story about the area. And we kind of did that mainly through kind of word of mouth and going around and, you know, building on sort of community relationships. Because, I mean, an area like this, word of mouth is the way to get to people. I mean, very few people have computers, for example. You know, sort of smart kind of technology ways of reaching people really don't work that well in the area. You know, it's about talking to people and then they go away and talk to someone else, and that's kind of how things happen. Okay, right, I'll just whip through this very quickly then. So this is just an example of some of the objects. So I won't say what they are, except to make the general point that for something like this, some of the objects are actually very mundane, and it's actually the sort of stories they tell that's interesting rather than the objects themselves. So, for example, there's a stone from the boundary wall of a mansion that has been demolished. There's some coal, which is the last coal to be dug out of the area. And then just very, very quickly, the next phase of this was as part of this Imagine project. We decided that we'd actually digitise it, and that is sort of ongoing at the moment, creating a website that actually has these objects in it. And it's kind of image-led, but there's sort of information, photographs that goes with it, information about the objects and the locations of them. And I'll miss this bit off, Right, thank you very much.